Man-made global warming. Is CO2 really warming us? Since 1988, man-made global warming has slowly taken over as the only accepted science of climate change. It's not always been this way. Do we affect a planet we only populate 10% of? Does CO2 directly affect temperature? How much CO2 is man-made compared to naturally occurring CO2? This is what I found out. Early last century, warming temperatures started to cause concern after a prolonged period without cooling. November 1922, Monthly Weather Review. The changing Arctic. The Arctic seems to be warming up. Reports from the fishermen, seal hunters and sea explorers who sail the seas about Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climate conditions and hereafter unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognisable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often marine accumulations of earth and often stone. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they are now entirely disappeared. Also saying, last winter the ocean did not freeze over, even at the north coast of Spitsbergen. Does this not sound similar to predictions now a little bit? Rochester Democrat, December 17th, 1939. Glaciers mounting over Greenland. Stockholm, Sweden. INS. All the glaciers in eastern Greenland are rapidly melting. Also saying, it may well without exaggeration be said that the glaciers like those in Norway face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. They're melting everywhere. It's 1939. We're hardly doing anything yet. February the 18th, 1952. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago. Sounds familiar. February the 18th, 1952. New York, February 17th. Dr. William S. Carlson, an Arctic expert, said last night that polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexpected rate and threatening to swamp seaports by raising ocean levels. Also saying, the glaciers of Norway and Alaska, he said, are only half the size they were 50 years ago. The temperatures around Spitsbergen have so modified that the sailing time has lengthened from 3 to 8 months of the year. Well, this is only like less than 100 years ago, so why are we so shocked now? The New York Times, Sunday, October the 19th, 1958. The changing face of the Arctic. Some scientists estimate that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was half a century ago. And that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole, as the submarine Nautilus and the Skate Recent sailed under it. A ship bound from New York to Tokyo could save 2,500 miles. Although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust on the whole, only about 7 feet thick, over an ocean 2 miles deep in places. Wonder when the fantasy of the melting ice cap really started. In 1961, the world had stopped warming. CO2 levels climbed as we'd rebuilt after World War II. Temperatures dropped for 30 years. Oops. The New York Times, Monday, January the 30th, 1961. Scientists agree, the world is getting cooler. An assembly of specialists from several continents seem to have reached an anonymous agreement on only one point: it's getting colder. July 18th, 1963. Norway's glaciers are in the process of becoming thicker again, after a period of 200 years of gradual melting down, according to glaciologist Mr. Overall Laystall. The New York Times. New York, Saturday, July the 18th, 1970. US and Soviet press. Studies of a colder Arctic. The United States and the Soviet Union are mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate is becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become anomalously thick, and whether the extent of the ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. The Guardian, November the 20th, 1974. The threat of a new ice age must now stand alongside nuclear war as a likely source of wholesale death and misery for mankind. Well, that's a change of tone. 3rd of December 1972. A letter from Brown University to the President. Dear Mr. President, aware of your deep concern with the future of the world, we feel obliged to inform you of the results of a scientific conference held here recently. The conference dealt with the past and future changes of climate and was attended by 42 top American and European investigators. We encase a summary report published in Science and further publications are forthcoming in quarterly research. The main conclusion of the meeting was that the global deterioration of climate by order of magnitude larger than any hitherto experienced by civilized mankind is a very real possibility and indeed may be due very soon. The cooling has a natural cause and falls within the rank of process which preceded the last ice age. This is a surprising result based largely on recent studies of deep sea sediments. Existing data still do not allow forecast of the precise timing of the predicted development, nor the assessment of man's enforcement with the natural trends. It could not be excluded, however, that the cooling now underway in the Northern Hemisphere is the start of an expected shift. The present rate of the cooling seems fast enough to bring glacial temperatures in about a century, if continued at the present pace. The practical consequences which might be brought on such developments of existing social institutes are, among others, substantially lowered food production due to the shortened growing seasons and changed rain distribution in the main growing production belts of the world, with Eastern Europe and Central Asia to be firstly affected. Increased frequency and amplitude of extreme weather anomalies, such as those bringing floods, sandstorms and killing frosts. They're familiar. January the 29th, 1974. Space satellites show new ice age coming fast. Well, everyone's agreeing it's getting cold. Sunday, March the 2nd, 1975. New ice age on way soon. In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in this century, ships making their Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. Many climatologists see these signs as evidence that a significant shift in climate is taking place. A shift that could be the forerunner of an ice age, like that gripped much of the Northern Hemisphere before retreating 10,000 years ago. March the 1st, 1975. Science news. The scientists. The ice age cometh. Well, they seem to think it's coming. The New York Times, Thursday, January the 5th, 1978. International team of specialists finds no end in sight, 30-year cooling trend in Northern Hemisphere. Due to data from the Southern Hemisphere, particularly south of latitude 30 south, are so meagre that reliable conclusions are not possible. The New York Times, January the 8th, 1978. An international team of specialists has concluded from 8 indices of climate that there is no end in sight to the cooling trend of the last 30 years, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's really cold for quite a while then. Sunday, March the 11th, 1979. One thing is indisputable. The world has been cooling off since World War II. Dr. J. Murray Michael of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration said the world has been cooling off for a long run. On an average, it's cooled down by something like 1 degree Fahrenheit or half a degree Celsius, and that cooling has been around World War II. But things are about to change. In June 1988, Dr. Hansen predicted his theory on man-made global warming. At this point, the science was still up for debate. October 5th, 1988. NASA climatologist James E. Hansen, 99% certain. That's what he says, 99% certain. By the 1990s, that die will be loaded, with 3 or 4 faces coming up hot. When it's rolled, the research has concluded. That means that the chances of any particular summer being hotter than normal would top 50% compared with 33% chances of the past. Analysts of warming since 1881 show most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the most recent sharp rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, said Thomas Carl of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Clerical Data Center in Asheville, NC. While global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979, Carl said. In 2008, Dr. Hansen predicted that in 10 to 5 years, the North Pole would be free of ice in the summertime. Oops. June the 24th, 2008. NASA scientists, we're toast. Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years, the Arctic will be free of sea ice in the summer. But Ed Markley DeMass, committee chairman, said Dr. Hansen was right 20 years later. We recognise him as a climate prophet. I don't think he was. Recent data suggests that the ice is in fact building again. He could not have been more wrong. Oops. This is temperature data from all 5 data sources, all agreeing on the world temperatures. I will now show where their monitoring stations were at them times. 1891 to 1920. Not much coverage there. Location of all NOAA GHCH stations with daily temperature data in 8080. Still a big chunk of the world missing from the dataset. 20 years later, some improvement. I still wouldn't call it a global temperatures, mostly northern hemisphere. Another 40 years, still mostly Northern America. Not really doing so well on the other side either, are we? Oops. With such poor coverage, how can they have such good data? The different parts of the world all have the same data. You know, really, how is that even statistically possible on a global scale? Anyway, let's check some CO2 data alongside our questionable temperature data. Just have a quick look at the Minoan, the Roman and the medieval warm. They all look a bit warmer than us. But yeah, the CO2. I can't see a match either. Anyone see a link there? Let's take a closer look. We know it got cold for 30 years around 1960. Check out that CO2 spiking 1950. Whoa. So in 1950 we started to massively add CO2 to the atmosphere, but we started to cool in 1960 for 30 years. Okay. Also recently we have shown cooling trends for the last 2 years, while CO2 is at its highest recorded levels. And if it's CO2, why is the line not just going up? Why has it been going down for 2 years, and now we're only at 0.28 from average, so we're barely warm at all. How is this the end of the world because of CO2? Did you know when they say it's never been warmer on record, that's what it means, on record. It's actually been warmer most of our history. Even the IPCC in 1990 admit it was warmer, just not on record. Just thought we'd have a look at this again. Have another look at that temperature line, going down, not up. If you look closely, you will see that we have been cooling for approximately 3,200 years. Maybe global temperature affects CO2 absorption. In 1990, Dr. Hansen made some predictions based on global warming models. Let's see how they worked out. Oh dear. This guy's good. To be so wrong again, but still have a job and have everyone thinking he's right. High five that fella. So in answer to my last question, how much CO2 do we contribute? It is actually approximately 3.225%. That's all. And that's not including any of the underwater volcanoes that we just haven't taken into account yet. So it's guaranteed to be less than that. In concluding, I think we've achieved many things in our time here, but I don't think warming the planet is one of them. If there is any link with CO2 and temperature, I think the planet controls the CO2, not CO2 controlling the planet.